What is real reading? This is a question that haunted me as a student, and I still encounter as a future English teacher. How do we know that students are being challenged appropriately? How do we know that what they're reading will improve their test scores? I have some better questions. How do we know that students will still be passionate about reading and storytelling outside of the classroom? Are we cultivating a culture of literacy? Do human beings exist to serve language, processing letters to words to formulate grammatically correct sentences the same way a computer processes numbers? Or is language our tool for self-expression? I am tired of defining reading as a measure of misery. Students and educators alike are missing the forest for the trees when it comes to reading, missing the vast scope of storytelling and human expression when we read for a test score and a grade. I have devoted much of my research in my education classes to figuring out how to include graphic novels in every area of the curriculum, not just for struggling readers, but for students who need to be challenged. Often I find myself defending the medium to parents and teachers, and even myself, with works such as Mouse, Fun Home, and Persepolis. These are all wonderful works that I highly recommend, but they're all nonfiction centered around the most devastating situations a person can experience. And is suffering the only emotion that real reading should evoke? Is it what motivates us to immerse ourselves in literature? I use these works and others like them to prove that the medium is not just silly superhero comic books. But I do not believe that superheroes and comic books are silly. In fact, I believe they possess great depth. Why should I have to hide my enthusiasm for this medium when I think that enthusiasm for storytelling is exactly what education and our culture is missing? The only difference between a comic book and a graphic novel is that a comic is published serially, the same way that a TV show airs a new episode every week. Except for comics are never ending, they are only told fresh by new hands throughout the years. A comic book storyline can be connected into a graphic novel and garner some prestige from that. But ultimately, graphic novels are inspired by comic books, and the language and history of comics is rich and detailed and worthy of study. When we dismiss an entire medium as fake reading, we give ourselves permission to accept their messaging uncritically. Visual sequential story, when I speak of comic books, we often think of superheroes. And that's a genre, and it's not the only genre that the medium has to offer, but it is the origin story. So let's talk about superheroes, because they have been dominating pop culture for decades, and for too long, we have allowed ourselves to think of them as simply neutral. Visual sequential storytelling has existed for as long as humanity has had writing. The practice arguably goes back to ancient Egypt, but it is the political cartoons of the American progressive era that gives birth to the comic book as we know it. Today, we study these newspaper cartoons as historical documents, telling us just as much about the time period as the writing in the newspaper itself. And that was true at the time as well. Some of the greatest stories of the era were reported on using cartoons, creating lasting social and political change. But at the time, they were spoken of the same way our parents talk about iPhones. They're corrupting the youth. There's nothing of substance. They're rotting your brain. This backlash separated the cartoons and comic strips from newspaper, giving birth to a new medium, the comic book. This new art form was created and pioneered and perfected by Jewish American immigrants, all out of a passion for the stories that they could tell, but for many, because they were denied opportunities in traditional journalism. This industry was deeply involved in current events and created a new American identity, and yet it was less than glamorous, did not pay well, and would not get your name in the history books. You likely don't know the names Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, but you do know the name Superman. The character debuted in 1939. For a little historical context, Hitler was invading Poland, Jewish people and other persecuted groups were fleeing Europe, and America was accepting very few refugees. Schuster and Siegel took inspiration from Friedrich Nietzsche's theory of the Übermensch, the idea that the pinnacle of humanity could be achieved through good breeding. The idea was in the zeitgeist at the time because it was the foundation of Nazi eugenics pseudoscience. But Schuster and Siegel took this idea and they combined it with their Jewish heritage, pulling inspiration from Moses to translate the Übermensch to Superman. This pinnacle was not achieved through eugenics, but rather his power comes from the fact that he is an outsider, an immigrant, and a foreigner. The Superman that they presented to the public was not the ideal of humanity because of removal, but because of inclusion, and his belief that all human life was worthy of being protected. The idea of the Übermensch is twisted once again in 1941 by Jack Kirby and Joe Simon with the invention of Captain America. He's blonde, he's blue-eyed, and he's punching Hitler in the face. This may seem apolitical now, but at the time it was a deeply radical statement, as the United States had not yet declared war on Germany, and many Americans were in support of Nazi ideals. Simon and Kirby's office would receive several threats of violence while they worked on the Captain America comic. But yet, to see the ideal man that Hitler and his followers obsessed over, and he wants nothing to do with the fascism that idolized him, was a powerful statement, made even more powerful by who was telling it. Simon and Kirby pulled from Jewish culture, such as myths of the Golem, and combined him with American iconography to beg their government to get involved in the war and protect their people from a genocide. Comics became a voice for the voiceless, a way to call on those with power to protect those who had none. The comics of this time period were deeply engaged in current events and formed a new American identity. And yet, they were still dismissed as childish and corrupting because of who was writing them. After World War II, the comic book industry expands. New companies, new creators, and new characters are invented. And the Comic Code of Authority is established to show parents that comic books are wholesome, all-American fun. But the comics' connection to current events is not severed. In fact, this aspect of them only grows. Spider-Man would attend anti-war protests in the 60s and 70s. Superheroes and sidekicks alike were shown grappling with America's drug crisis. Marvel's X-Men used the metaphor of mutants to explore ideas of race and intersectionality. And Captain America and Superman were no longer across the ocean fighting Nazis, but instead at home fighting the Klan. These stories are deeply engaged in the question of justice. What is it? Who gets to decide what it is? And how is it enacted? This medium has created a whole new way of telling stories, a whole new literacy. I can point you to countless comics that are engaged in the socio-political events of their time, and our time too, as this legacy is continued today. But I encourage you to seek them out on your own. Get curious and try something new, and approach it the same way you would a novel or a piece of art in a museum, as something an artist poured themselves into because they believed they had a story worthy of being heard. I don't want to give you the wrong idea here. Superheroes in comic books are not inherently perfect because of their origin in immigration and the progressive era. For every forward-thinking, politically engaged comic, there is another that barely rocks the boat and stands with those who already hold the power. But how can you know the difference if you've already dismissed the entire medium as frivolous, as fake reading? Our culture is filled with superheroes. I'm willing to bet that everyone in this room has seen a movie based off of a comic book. But did you really think about that movie? Or did you lose yourself in the action and spectacle? The superheroes of the big blockbuster screen are just as politically engaged, asking questions of truth and justice and the new American way. How often do you question what they're saying? When we dismiss an entire genre, an entire medium as anti-intellectual, as nothing more than popcorn movies and filler entertainment, as nothing more than children's picture books. We give ourselves permission to accept their messaging uncritically, to allow them to hold space within ourselves without examination. When we say a piece of art has no value, we cannot see the values it is displaying, and we accept them as neutral. Real reading doesn't just take place in a traditional novel and in the classroom. It is engaged every second of every day because literacy extends beyond letters. It is every form of communication. I hope I have convinced you to give a second chance to comic books and graphic novels. The superhero genre is only a small piece of what the medium has to offer. There's truly something for everyone. But most importantly, I encourage you to re-examine and think critically about every piece of art and fiction that you deemed unworthy of the title of real. Thank you.